She found herself relegated to the hall's most overlooked table. Donning a dress from a thrift store, she gripped her napkin, finding solace in its texture, using it as a shield against the sea of unfamiliar faces. Lost in the opulent scenery, no one seemed to notice her until a man, exuding charisma and style, drew whispers and curious stares. He approached her table, pulling out the chair next to hers, and inquired if it was taken. She surmised that he would excuse himself after the obligatory salad, but little did she know, that simple act would set off a chain of events that would alter her life forever. What transpired next was beyond anyone's wildest dreams. If this story resonates with you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know your location in the comments. Your support fuels our passion and empowers us to continue sharing stories like this one. Olivia Hart nervously smoothed the hem of her vintage lilac dress for the third time, tugging it gently, as if she could stretch her confidence along with the delicate fabric. The Ravensshire Estate Hotel lobby shimmered under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, bathing everything in a golden light that clung like an expensive perfume. It was a place designed for polished shoes, impressive last names, and silk gowns that whispered of wealth with every graceful step. She felt out of place, a stranger in a world of elegance and affluence. Emily, her childhood friend, the bride's cousin, and now a radiant bridesmaid, had pleaded with her to come. "You'll love it," she'd promised, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "And I won't know a soul if you're not there." Despite the unease that always settled in her stomach when she entered rooms where elegance was a form of currency, Olivia had reluctantly agreed. Inside the grand ballroom, a symphony of sparkle and sophistication unfolded. Women glided past in gowns that shimmered like water under the soft lights. Men in impeccably tailored tuxedos sipped champagne from crystal glasses that looked as though they'd never been touched by human hands. A string quartet tucked away in the corner played a classical melody, perhaps Vivaldi, and laughter danced with the music, curling into the high ceilings like delicate smoke. Olivia was gently escorted to a round table tucked away in the room's farthest corner. Table 7, as the little white card proclaimed, was clearly an afterthought, the kind of place reserved for guests who didn't quite fit the mold. To her right sat a teenage boy completely absorbed in the digital world of his phone. To her left, a woman in her late 70s who seemed to drift off to sleep between courses. Across the table, two middle-aged men were engaged in a silent competition to see who could avoid eye contact for the longest duration. She settled into her chair, gracefully folded her hands in her lap, and offered the room a practiced smile. Polite, pleasant, unassuming. Her dress, a charming find from a thrift shop, looked modest but lovely in daylight. However, here, beneath the scrutiny of the chandeliers, it appeared faded and lackluster. The once delicate lace looked tired, and her shoes felt slightly too tight. She had carefully styled her hair into soft waves, hoping for a touch of romance, but instead, she just felt conspicuously out of place. The worst part wasn't being alone. It was being invisible, lost in the sea of mingling guests. She watched Emily from afar, dazzling and effortless in her pale green gown, surrounded by people who effortlessly navigated the social nuances, knowing precisely which fork to use and how to glide across the marble floor with effortless grace. Olivia glanced down at her untouched salad, poking at the greens as if they might offer her some form of companionship. She took a sip of lukewarm water and tried to resist the urge to shrink in her chair. She reminded herself that she wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here for Emily. She possessed a warm heart, a quick wit, and a gentle laugh. That should be enough, she reasoned. Still, her chest tightened with the familiar ache of feeling overlooked, not just tonight, but in life. She arranged flowers for a living, helping others celebrate their most beautiful moments, and then quietly disappeared once the petals began to fall. It had become her rhythm. Bloom for others, wilt in silence. A burst of laughter erupted from one of the central tables, and Olivia looked up. The centerpieces there were twice as tall, and the people twice as loud. Confidence seemed to exude from their conversations. Her gaze drifted to the dance floor, where couples swayed in perfect synchronization, spinning under the soft lighting like scenes from a movie she hadn't been cast in. She pulled her phone from her clutch, pretending to scroll through it, pretending not to care. But then something shifted in the atmosphere. It wasn't a sound, more like a sudden hush. A breath held. A silence, subtle but undeniable, rolled through the room like the quiet before a storm. And then she saw him. He stepped into the ballroom with an undeniable air of authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored black suit with a dark gray tie loosened just enough to hint at a dangerous edge beneath the polished exterior. His presence didn't demand attention. It simply absorbed it, drawing every eye in the room towards him. A ripple of whispers followed him as he moved, but he didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His eyes, a piercing shade of green, swept across the room, slow and deliberate. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She quickly averted her gaze, suddenly self-conscious of how alone she looked, but something in the air told her not to move. She dared one more glance, and that was when it happened. He was walking toward her. She blinked, questioning her perception. Was he really coming in her direction? She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone more glamorous to be standing behind her. But no, he stopped right beside her chair. His leather shoes polished to a mirror shine, the faintest hint of cedar cologne lingering in the air. Then, in a voice rich and calm, he asked, "Is this seat taken?" Olivia's throat went dry. Her pulse thudded in her ears. "No, no," she stammered, flustered. She gestured toward the empty chair beside her. "Please." He smiled. Not the kind of smile that apologized or excused itself. No, this one was intentional, curious, and disarming. And then he sat down at table 7 with her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rest of the ballroom continued to buzz with activity, but Olivia felt as though they had stepped outside of it, into a quieter space. A space that didn't adhere to the rules of chandeliers and champagne. She noticed details. The way his cufflink shimmered like the sky before a storm, the barely visible scar on his left temple. The way he looked at her, not through her, not around her, but directly at her. "I'm Ethan," he said simply, extending a hand. She took it, her fingers tingling at the touch. "Olivia." "Nice to meet you, Olivia," he said, his voice wrapping around her name like it was something precious. "I was late, and I needed an escape route. You seemed like the safest bet." She laughed, genuinely surprised by the sound. "Escape route? From what?" "From the madness of relatives who think marriage is a finish line. From women trying to match me with their daughters." This table seemed calm. Olivia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You chose the misfit table on purpose?" He leaned in slightly conspiratorially. The best stories usually start at the wrong tables. She didn't know what surprised her more, that he'd said it or that a part of her actually believed him. And just like that, the night shifted. She was no longer the invisible girl in the faded dress. Something stirred within her chest, not nerves, not fear, but the first flicker of being seen, really seen, for the first time in a very, very long time. The chair beside her gave a soft creak as Ethan Montgomery settled into it, and Olivia could hardly believe it was real. She tried to breathe normally, but every cell in her body was suddenly alert, as though someone had turned up the brightness on the room. She glanced sideways, pretending to adjust her napkin, stealing another look at the stranger who'd so effortlessly disrupted her quiet invisibility. Ethan. His name echoed in her thoughts, foreign and familiar all at once. He reached for the glass of water in front of him and took a sip as though he belonged there, at this neglected table with its half-eaten salads and forgotten guests. Olivia noticed how even his smallest movements were deliberate and graceful. His fingers were strong, his nails neatly trimmed. A man who paid attention to details. She cleared her throat gently. "So, you're not a fan of the main festivities?" He smiled, a slow, thoughtful kind of smile. "Let's just say I've already met my quota of fake laughs and small talk for the night." His voice had a smooth timbre, warm but slightly weary. Olivia tilted her head, intrigued. "And yet here you are at a wedding." "My best friend's wedding," he clarified. "I couldn't skip it. But I didn't sign up for the matchmaking committee or the business pitches between courses." You got business pitches at a wedding? She asked, raising an eyebrow in surprise. Oh yes, he said with a chuckle. One guy tried to show me a real estate deal on his phone while we were toasting the bride. Olivia laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that shook her shoulders. That's tragic. Exactly, Ethan said, watching her. That's why I came looking for a different kind of conversation, and here you are. There was something in the way he said it, not flirtatious, not exaggerated, just genuine, as though he actually wanted to be there, as though this moment wasn't an accident. You might be disappointed, Olivia said lightly. I'm just a florist who was dragged here by her best friend. I don't think that's disappointing at all, he replied. Besides, I like flowers. She smiled, her fingers brushing the rim of her water glass. Did you grow up around them? Actually, my mother had a greenhouse. Orchids mostly. She swore they had moods. She's not wrong, Olivia said, a spark lighting in her chest. They do. Some bloom better when you talk to them. Others just want space. Ethan leaned in slightly, resting an elbow on the table. What do you do when one refuses to bloom at all? Patience, she said without hesitation. And a little faith. Their eyes locked then, just for a second too long, and Olivia felt something shift. The music, the clinking glasses, the chatter. It all faded into the background. Can I ask you something? Ethan said after a beat. Sure. Do you always sit at the corner table and make the rest of the room look like it's missing something? She blushed, startled by the unexpected compliment. You don't even know me. I'm trying to, he said simply. But I'm already glad I came late. She didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't often someone saw her so directly, as if her presence wasn't just noticed, but appreciated. Most people looked through her, past her. He was doing neither. Where's your seat supposed to be? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He shrugged. Up front, next to the groom. But he won't miss me for an hour or two. You're a groomsman? Guilty, he said, smiling again. And guilty of desertion. That's quite a risk. Worth it, I think. Their conversation drifted into gentle, curious exchanges. He asked about her favorite flowers. She talked about the way peonies made her feel like spring could start again. He told her about a trip to the Scottish Highlands where he got lost and ended up having tea with a shepherd's wife. They laughed about weddings, about awkward toasts, about how both of them had nearly left early tonight, but neither of them had. Time, like the music, seemed to loop in soft circles around them. The longer they talked, the less Olivia noticed the rest of the ballroom. She stopped shrinking into her chair. Her spine straightened. Her voice softened and warmed. At one point, a waiter approached and tried to discreetly whisper something in Ethan's ear. Mr. Montgomery, the family is asking. Ethan lifted a hand. Tell them I'm exactly where I want to be. The waiter hesitated, then nodded and stepped away. Olivia blinked. Mr. Montgomery. Ethan exhaled. Right. I suppose that's fair to explain. My name's Ethan Montgomery. I run a company. A few, actually. She tilted her head. You say that like you're trying not to sound like a CEO. I'm trying not to sound like a cliché, he replied. But yes, I own Montgomery and Company. We're in tech, real estate, investments, boring stuff, really. Her mind reeled slightly. She'd heard that name on a billboard in an ad, maybe in a headline once. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but he noticed. You okay? Yeah. Just. She laughed nervously. That explains the waiter and the tux that fits like it was sewn on you. I prefer when people don't know. It's exhausting being seen for your bank account. Olivia looked at him then, truly looked, and she realized he wasn't exaggerating. For all his polish and confidence, there was a weariness behind his eyes, a quiet kind of loneliness. Well, she said gently, you're safe at table 7. Here you're just the guy who likes orchids. He chuckled, something softening in him. Good. I needed that. A sudden shift in the lighting signaled the start of the first dance. The bride and groom swayed in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by applause. Olivia watched them. The way the bride's dress floated like a cloud, the way the groom whispered something that made her smile. Ethan turned to her. "Do you dance?" She blinked. "I don't dance well." "Perfect. I don't either." He stood and offered his hand. Not insistent, not flashy, just open. "I won't step on your toes," he promised. Her heart pounded. She hadn't danced in years. Not in a room like this. Not with a man like him. But something inside her said yes. She took his hand, and everything changed. The dance floor was a glowing stage beneath 1,000 tiny lights. Olivia stood just beyond the golden edge, her fingers still wrapped in Ethan's. His grip was warm, confident, but not demanding. He wasn't pulling her. He was waiting for her to choose. She hesitated for a moment longer, her heart thumping in her ears, then took a step forward, and then another. He led her gently onto the floor, their steps in sync, though neither of them had said a word. The music shifted into a slow, almost haunting melody, a cello piece wrapped in soft piano notes. Around them, couples moved in smooth, practiced rhythms, but Olivia was barely aware of anyone else. All she could feel was Ethan's hand resting lightly at her waist, his other hand guiding hers with surprising care. "You're doing better than you warned me," he murmured, his voice close enough to stir the fine hairs near her ear. She smiled nervously. "That's because you're not stepping on me yet," he teased. They laughed, and something broke open between them. Not in a dramatic way, but gently, like the slow parting of curtains after years of darkness. The kind of laughter that makes your body remember what it's like to be light again. As they moved, Olivia dared to look up into his eyes. They were greener under the ballroom lights, like moss caught in sunlight. And he was looking right at her, not at the room, not at the other dancers, not at his reflection in the polished floor, but at her like she was the center of his attention, like she mattered. "So," he said, tilting his head, "Olivia the florist, tell me something you've never told anyone at a wedding." She blinked. "That's very specific." "I know," he replied. "It makes it more interesting." She thought for a moment. "Okay, I've always wanted to run away with the wedding cake." He raised an eyebrow, clearly delighted. "The whole cake? Every tier? That's impressively bold." She shrugged. "People spend hours tasting samples and designing the perfect cake and then barely eat it. Seems like a waste. You'd be doing the world a service." "Exactly." He laughed, and it was a full sound, deep and genuine. "I like the way you think." She smirked. "Your turn. Come on, Montgomery. Confess." He leaned closer. "Fine. I once switched the playlist at a wedding mid-reception." "No. Yes. What did you put on?" "Bohemian Rhapsody. 3 times in a row." Olivia gasped. "You're a menace and proud of it," he said, his mouth curling into a half-grin. They continued dancing, lost in their own world. Olivia noticed how her nerves had quieted, how her body had stopped bracing for disappointment, how she felt, for the first time in ages, like she wasn't performing. She wasn't being the reliable friend, the modest girl, the invisible seat filler. She was just Olivia, and Ethan seemed to like that version of her. "I have a theory," he said after a pause. "Oh boy," he chuckled. "I think some people meet like flint and steel, lots of sparks, but they burn out fast. And then some meet like roots finding each other underground." She tilted her head, curious. "What kind are we?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I like the way this feels." She didn't answer, not with words, but her fingers tightened around his hand. Eventually, the song faded, replaced by something faster, more lively. The dance floor erupted into more energetic motion. Ethan stepped back slightly, reluctant to let go. "Want to keep going?" he asked. She glanced around. "I think we just survived one song without major injury. Might be best to quit while we're ahead." "Fair point," he said, offering his arm like a gentleman. "Shall we retreat?" They returned to table 7, now oddly warm in its familiarity. Olivia's water glass had gone untouched. Her salad was even less appetizing than before, but none of it mattered now. As they sat, the air between them remained charged, but in a calm way, like a storm had passed and left behind the kind of silence that feels sacred. Ethan rested his elbow on the table and looked at her. "You're not what I expected, good or bad." "Unexpected doesn't need a label," he replied. "It just stays with you." She smiled softly. "You're not what I expected either. Because I own companies?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "Because you sit at tables like this when you could sit anywhere." He seemed to study her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, "I sit where I find something worth staying for." It hit her harder than she wanted to admit. She looked down, brushing a non-existent crumb from the tablecloth. "You know," he continued, "it's strange. I've spent years walking into rooms like this, filled with people, noise, performances, and I've never wanted to stay as much as I do right now." Olivia looked up. His eyes hadn't moved. They were still on her. A strange warmth spread through her chest. She should have been skeptical, defensive, but something about the way he spoke, the way he didn't try to impress her, made it hard to keep her walls up. "What happens next?" she asked, half teasing, half curious. Ethan leaned back, thoughtful. "Well, I'd offer to buy you dinner. Proper one. With real conversation and less glitter." She laughed. "That sounds nice. I'd like that too." They sat in silence for a beat, the kind that didn't feel awkward, but full, pregnant with possibility. Then someone called Ethan's name from across the room. It was the groom waving, clearly wondering where he'd disappeared to. Ethan glanced at Olivia, then back at his friend. "I should go say hello," he said a little reluctantly. She nodded. "Of course. Go be a groomsman." He stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks. Then he turned to her. "Don't disappear." She blinked. "I won't." He smiled. "Good." And with that, he walked away, weaving through tuxedos and sequins, leaving behind the scent of cedar and something harder to define, something she couldn't quite name yet. Olivia sat there, her fingers still tingling from where they had touched. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but it felt like something rare, something she didn't want to lose. When Ethan returned, it wasn't with the casual stride of earlier, but with an almost magnetic focus. His eyes found Olivia across the room, like she was gravity, like something in him recognized exactly where to go. She was still at table 7, tracing the rim of her glass with the tip of her finger, lost in thought. She looked up and saw him coming, and for the briefest moment, she forgot how to breathe. "You stayed," he said softly as he pulled the chair beside her. "I said I would," she replied, tilting her head. He smiled. "I don't always believe people when they promise things." "Well," she replied, tilting her head, "maybe tonight's the exception." A familiar slow rhythm began to play, the kind of music that fills a room with quiet anticipation. Not flashy, not loud, just intimate. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the dance floor, then back to her. "Can I tempt you into another?" He stood and extended his hand. "Even after I told you I'm a terrible dancer? Anyway, I'll take my chances." And something about the way he said it, unrushed, steady, sure, made her heart move before her feet did. She slid her fingers into his, allowing him to guide her once more into that soft golden space where chandeliers sparkled like stars, and the world quieted just enough to hear your own heartbeat. This time he held her a little closer, and this time she didn't pull back. Their hands found each other naturally, and his other hand rested gently at the small of her back. There was nothing hurried in his movements, no show, just presence. He was there, she was there, and the music carried them. Around them, couples danced with practiced grace, but Olivia wasn't watching. She didn't care about anyone else's rhythm or elegance. She was too consumed by the way Ethan moved with her, how he anticipated her weight before she shifted, how his touch was confident but never possessive, like he wasn't leading her but discovering the dance with her. "How do you do that?" she whispered. "Do what?" "Make me feel like I've done this before." He smiled against her temple. "Because you have. You just forgot." She swallowed hard, unsure whether it was the music or his voice making her chest ache. As the dance unfolded, their silence became the loudest thing between them, Not uncomfortable, not hesitant. It was the silence of something building. His fingers brushed the back of her shoulder, then moved as if by instinct to tuck a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. His knuckles skimmed her cheek as he did it, and she leaned just slightly into the gesture. Her breath caught. So did his. "I don't usually dance at weddings," he murmured. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "You're pretty good at pretending you do," he chuckled. "Maybe you're just easy to dance with." Their gazes held longer this time. There was a stillness in the space between their faces, a fragile closeness that hummed with possibility. Olivia didn't know if it was appropriate. She didn't know if anyone was watching, and for the first time in her life she didn't care. She was in the arms of a man who had sat beside her when she had been invisible, who asked real questions, who listened, who danced with her like she mattered. The song slowed, then faded. They stopped moving, but neither of them stepped away. His hand lingered on her back, her fingers curled just slightly into his. And there, beneath the chandeliers, Ethan leaned his forehead softly against hers. No kiss, no pressure, just presence. "I could get used to this," he whispered. She smiled with her eyes closed. "Me too." The lights dimmed further as another song began. Something livelier. A signal for more energetic guests to take over the floor. Couples passed them with laughter and clicking heels. And finally Ethan stepped back, but not far. "Let's get some air," he suggested. Olivia nodded, grateful. Her emotions had tangled themselves into a quiet knot, and she felt a knot forming in her stomach, a tension that threatened to unravel in front of everyone. She needed to escape before it all came spilling out. He sensed her unease, reaching for her hand once more. His touch gentle and familiar, as if he'd offered it 1,000 times before. Together, they slipped through a side door, emerging onto a terrace draped in a canopy of twinkling string lights. The cool night air, a welcome balm, kissed Olivia's flushed cheeks. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the refreshing chill soothe her frayed nerves. The terrace overlooked a sprawling garden, still redolent with the lingering fragrance of summer blooms. Roses, ivy, and the clean scent of freshly cut grass mingled in the air as Olivia leaned against the railing, inhaling deeply. "Better?" Ethan asked, his voice a comforting presence beside her. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't expect tonight to feel like this." "Me neither." They stood in comfortable silence, their shoulders almost touching, a subtle electricity crackling between them. It wasn't a jolt, but a low, steady current, humming beneath the surface of their unspoken words. "I've been to a lot of weddings," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "Most of them feel like performances, like everyone is playing a role." She turned to face him, intrigued. "But tonight," he continued, his gaze intense, "tonight felt like something real actually happened." She didn't reply, the air thick with unspoken understanding. She didn't need to. Ethan turned towards her, a question dancing in his eyes, not a demand, but an open space, an invitation. "I don't want this to be the last time I see you," he said simply, his voice laced with sincerity. Her throat tightened, a mix of fear and anticipation constricting her airway. "I don't either." She wanted to shout. Instead she whispered, "I don't either." They stood there, bathed in the silvery moonlight, their shadows merging on the stone terrace, both acutely aware that something significant had shifted, a subtle seismic event that had begun the moment he had sat beside her. Now everything felt different, irrevocably altered. "I'm not good at casual," she confessed suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I get attached. I feel too much. I overthink everything." Ethan stepped closer, his voice a soothing balm. "Good. The world needs more of that." She looked up at him, a question etched on her face. "You don't think that makes me hard to love?" He shook his head slowly, deliberately. "I think it makes you unforgettable." And Olivia, who had always been relegated to the supporting role, who had always danced around the edges of other people's stories, felt for the first time like she was standing at the center of her own narrative, finally taking center stage. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But as they stood on that terrace, side by side beneath the watchful stars, A promise hung in the air, unspoken, fragile, but undeniably true. And deep inside, Olivia knew, with a certainty that resonated in her soul, that this was only the beginning. The night deepened, settling into that hushed, contemplative hour when the air hung heavy with secrets, when even the loudest laughter softened into whispers, and the chandeliers began to dim, their light fading like that of tired stars. Olivia returned to the ballroom with Ethan, his hand resting lightly on her lower back as they re-entered the golden glow. The lingering magic of the dance still coursed through her limbs. Her skin still tingled where his fingers had brushed against her. And yet, as they crossed the marble floor towards table 7, she felt something else. Eyes. There were eyes on them. Whispers, subtle and clipped, stirred behind raised champagne flutes. Olivia tried to ignore them, but her curiosity got the better of her. She caught the flash of a raised eyebrow here, a murmured comment hidden behind a napkin there. A woman in a crimson dress leaned close to a man in a gray suit and tilted her head discreetly in their direction. A group near the cake table fell silent as Ethan passed, then resumed their conversation, speaking too quickly, too loudly. Olivia's stomach clenched. "Is it just me?" she asked under her breath. "Or are we suddenly the evening's entertainment?" Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the path ahead. "It's not you." The reassurance should have comforted her, but it didn't. Back at their table, she took a tentative sip from her water glass, her hands not feeling as steady as they had an hour ago. Ethan seemed calmer, unbothered even, but his posture had subtly shifted, his shoulders a bit tighter, his jaw more defined, as if he were holding something back, bracing for an impact. "You don't seem surprised," she said after a long pause, her voice barely audible. He glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "I'm not." She studied his face, searching for clues. "Do they always react like that when you talk to someone new?" A shadow crossed his expression, brief but undeniable. "Sometimes. That seems intense. It comes with the territory." She leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "Which territory is that exactly?" For a moment Ethan didn't answer. His gaze drifted towards the dance floor, where couples now swayed in less formal steps, their movements loose and uninhibited. The formal elegance of the evening was slowly giving way to loosened ties and kicked-off heels. Then he turned back to her, his voice quieter, more guarded. "My life doesn't leave much room for normal." Olivia tilted her head, intrigued. "Define not normal." "I've built a company people like to talk about, and a reputation people like to exaggerate. They see my name and fill in the blanks. Sometimes with awe, sometimes with envy, sometimes with fear." "Fear?" He exhaled, a hint of weariness in his voice. "Power makes people uncomfortable, especially when they don't understand how you use it." There it was again, that disarming honesty, the way he didn't evade her questions, but didn't offer more than she asked for either. It wasn't secrecy. It was discipline, the careful restraint of a man used to being scrutinized, a man who had learned to keep some things sacred, reserved only for himself. "Can I ask you something personal?" she ventured, her voice hesitant. "You've earned that right." She hesitated, gathering her courage. "Why me?" His brow furrowed slightly, a hint of confusion in his eyes. "What do you mean? Why did you sit with me? Stay with me? Everyone here clearly knows who you are. They expected you to be somewhere else with different people. People who match your world." A muscle in his cheek tensed. He leaned in, lowering his voice, his gaze unwavering. "Because when I walked into that ballroom tonight, everyone looked at me the same way they always do, with calculation, with expectation, like I was a puzzle they wanted to solve for their own benefit." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "But you," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "you looked at your salad like it was a complicated decision. You looked at the bride like she was magic. You looked at me like I was just a man." Olivia's throat tightened, her heart aching with a tenderness she hadn't expected. He continued, his voice softer now, laced with a vulnerability that surprised her. "You made me feel human. Do you know how rare that is?" She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Instead, she reached out, resting her hand gently on the back of his. He looked down at the touch, then up at her again, his eyes filled with a question. But before either of them could speak, a sharply dressed man in his 40s approached their table, his presence emanating an aura of quiet authority. He had the clean suit, the polished shoes, and the subtle air of command that marked him as someone who was accustomed to being heard. "Ethan," the man said, nodding curtly. "We need a word." Ethan's shoulders stiffened, his relaxed demeanor instantly vanishing. "Now?" The man gave Olivia a brief but assessing glance. Brief but necessary, preferably in private. Ethan sighed, the sound laced with resignation. He turned to her, his expression apologetic. "I'll be right back." She nodded, trying to sound casual. "Of course." He stood and followed the man towards a quieter corner of the ballroom, near the bar. Olivia watched them go, a knot of unease twisting in her stomach. The man spoke quickly, his gestures restrained but firm. Ethan listened, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She looked away, pretending not to watch, but a few moments later, she heard footsteps and turned to see Ethan returning, his jaw tight. "Everything okay?" she asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. He sat down, brushing invisible lint from his jacket. "Just a reminder that not everyone likes surprises," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Especially when they involve someone unexpected." Olivia blinked, her stomach dropping. "You mean me?" He didn't answer right away, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "My business partner. He's protective of the company, the brand, the image." A chill crept in, settling deep in her bones. "And I'm a threat to that image." Ethan's eyes met hers, sharp but not unkind. "You're a reminder that I don't always follow the script." She stared at the tablecloth, her heart sinking. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't. Still, I shouldn't be the reason people question your choices." "Olivia," he said, his voice firm but calm. "If being with you makes people uncomfortable, that says more about them than about you." She didn't respond right away, her fingers toying with the edge of her napkin. Then, finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and defiance. "I'm not used to this." "Used to what?" "Being noticed, protected, taken seriously." "You should be," he said, his certainty unsettling her in the best way. He leaned in again, his voice quieter this time, more intimate. "I don't want to scare you off." "You're not." A new song began to play, softer this time, a ballad filled with strings and silence, but neither of them moved to dance again. Instead, Ethan looked at her with a kind of gentle warning in his gaze. "There are things about my life I can't explain in one night," he said. "Not because I don't trust you, but because some things just take time." Olivia nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I understand." "Do you?" "I think so. I know what it's like to protect something fragile." He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable, as if he were searching for something hidden deep within her soul. Then he offered a single sentence that lingered in the air like a promise. "I'll let you in, just not all at once." And somehow that was enough. For now. The morning light filtered through Olivia's studio apartment like a quiet visitor. It crept along the worn hardwood floor, catching the scattered petals from yesterday's flower arrangements, and the half-finished bouquet resting on her tiny workbench. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air, soft and familiar, a comforting presence. She was still thinking about the wedding, about Ethan, about the way he had seen her, really seen her, as if she were the only person in the room. It had been 2 days, and he hadn't vanished like a dream. Instead, he'd sent a message that morning. _dinner tonight. I'll send a car. Dress for something comfortable. But let me surprise you. The message had arrived with a small bouquet of white peonies, her favorite, though she hadn't told him that. She read the text 3 times before replying, her fingers hovering hesitantly over the keys, her heart pounding against her ribs. _okay. I'll be ready. By 6:30, Olivia stood by the front door of her building, watching the sky change colors above the city, painting the skyline in hues of pink and gold. She wore a pale blue wrap dress, simple and soft, paired with sandals that had only a faint scuff on the heel, her nicest pair. She had no idea what to expect, and that both thrilled and terrified her. When the car pulled up, it wasn't just a car. It was a sleek black town car, polished like obsidian, with a driver in a dark uniform who stepped out and opened the door for her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Miss Hart?" the man asked with a polite nod. She blinked, momentarily overwhelmed. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery asked me to bring you to him." The drive was silent, smooth, surreal. Outside the tinted windows, the city shifted, transitioning from the familiar buzz of working-class corners to wide avenues lined with glittering glass towers and high-end marble storefronts. The sidewalks thinned, the cars became sleeker, the pedestrians more polished, their clothes impossibly chic. Her fingers tightened slightly around her clutch, her anxiety growing with each passing block. When the car stopped, the driver stepped out again and opened the door with the same calm grace. Olivia stepped onto the sidewalk and looked up, her breath catching in her throat. They were in front of a towering modern building with a mirrored facade that stretched towards the clouds, reflecting the city back on itself in an endless loop. At the entrance, a doorman nodded respectfully and held the door open before she could even touch it. She swallowed hard, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. This was another world. The lobby was silent but undeniably luxurious. Marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, reflecting the light from a chandelier that looked like a cascade of falling glass droplets. Every surface shimmered, pristine and untouchable. Before she could fully absorb the opulence, a private elevator opened with a soft whoosh. Inside, she stood alone as the elevator ascended quietly, faster than expected, smoother than anything she had ever experienced. Then the doors opened, and there he was. Ethan stood barefoot in the doorway of what could only be described as a penthouse carved out of a dream. He wore a navy sweater, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, and dark slacks, casual, comfortable, effortlessly elegant. "Hi," he said with a smile that didn't try too hard, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Hi," she replied, her voice soft, almost breathless. He extended a hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. "Come in." She stepped into the apartment, her sandals clicking softly against the dark hardwood floor. The space was open and airy, all clean lines and warm, inviting tones. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view of the city that took her breath away. Lights blinked in the distance, stretching out like a blanket of fallen stars. The skyline stretched as far as the eye could see, like a living painting, alive and endless. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with wonder. "Ethan, this is—" he chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "A bit much?" She gave a breathy laugh, her nerves easing slightly. "A bit, everything." He led her towards a dining area near the windows, where a small table was set for two. Candles flickered gently, casting a golden light over simple white plates and folded linen napkins. "I hope you're hungry," he said, his eyes twinkling mischievously. "I'm also slightly intimidated." "Good," he teased, that smile never wavering. "Keeps things interesting." They sat. A private chef, a quiet and unobtrusive presence, brought out dinner. Grilled salmon with a delicate citrus glaze, roasted vegetables arranged like works of art, and a dessert she couldn't pronounce, but adored at first bite. Everything was delicate and perfect and almost absurdly luxurious. And yet, somehow, Ethan managed to make it feel human, grounding the extravagance with his easy charm. He asked about her day, listened attentively when she talked about her coworker breaking a vase in the shop, laughed when she described a runaway cat that had nearly knocked over an entire floral arch. He spoke about his work only when she asked, and even then with a humility that surprised her. "Do you ever get tired of this?" she asked, gesturing around the room, taking in the panoramic view. He looked out the window, thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the distant lights. "Sometimes." "Of what?" "Of the view. The insulation." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Up here it's beautiful," he explained, his voice soft. "But it's also quiet, in a way that makes you forget what real noise feels like. It's easy to lose yourself in the height, to become disconnected." She nodded slowly, beginning to understand. You mean you stop feeling the ground beneath your feet? Exactly. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. I think that's why I wanted to see you again, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You remind me there's still gravity. She blushed, the warmth creeping up her neck. They stood after dinner, walking barefoot onto the balcony. The night was warm, the breeze soft. Below them, the city pulsed with life, tiny lights flickering like distant stars. This view, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. I could stare at it for hours. You can, he replied, his gaze unwavering. She glanced at him, surprised. I'm serious, he said. Anytime. It's yours too. She shook her head gently, a hint of sadness in her eyes. I don't know how to exist in a place like this. You already do, he said. He said it with such ease, such quiet certainty that for a moment she believed him. But then reality crept in, the doubts and insecurities she had tried so hard to suppress resurfacing with a vengeance. Olivia thought about her studio apartment with the creaky pipes and chipped tile, about the dresses she found in thrift stores and the coupons she clipped from magazines, about the way she counted every dollar every week, stretching her meager paycheck to cover rent and groceries. This was not her world. She looked down at her sandals, suddenly too aware of how plain they were, how out of place she felt. I don't want to be a project, she said, her voice almost a whisper, filled with a quiet desperation. Ethan turned to her sharply, his expression serious. You're not. I don't want to be someone you rescue from simplicity. He stepped closer, his gaze intense. That's not what this is. Then what is it? He took her hands in his touch steady and warm, a grounding force in the midst of her swirling doubts. It's me, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Choosing someone who makes me feel real in a life that too often feels staged. She searched his eyes, looking for any hint of deception. But what happens when this wears off? It hasn't yet, he replied, his gaze unwavering. And I'm not interested in letting it. They stood there, hands entwined, surrounded by glass and stars and the quiet hum of the city. Olivia didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. But her silence wasn't distance. It was permission, a tentative opening of her heart, and Ethan understood that. The wind played with a loose strand of her hair, gently teasing it across her face. He reached up, his touch feather-light, and tucked it behind her ear, his fingers lingering for a moment against her cheek. No performance, no promises, just the truth of a moment that neither of them had expected, and neither of them wanted to end. Olivia stood at her kitchen sink the next morning, rinsing the same mug twice without realizing it, her thoughts still tangled in the events of the night before. The scent of jasmine from her windowsill planter wafted through the air, but it felt like a fragrance from another lifetime, a distant echo of a dream. The night before lingered in her chest like a song with no clear ending, a melody that both haunted and captivated her. Ethan's penthouse, the dinner, the view, his words, they all replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't pause. She had walked into that world filled with curiosity, but she had left it questioning everything she thought she knew about herself and about him. On the surface, nothing had changed. She was still Olivia Hart, florist, renter of a one-room studio with creaky floors and a bathroom mirror slightly tilted to the left. Her shelves were still filled with books from second-hand stores and chipped mugs that didn't match. She still left the heater off on warmer nights to save money, and she still packed her lunch in the same worn container she had used since college. But something inside her had undeniably shifted, because now she knew exactly what it looked like to live above the clouds. She knew what it felt like to stand on marble floors and sip wine chosen by a sommelier whose name she couldn't pronounce. She had touched the silk of a world not her own, and it had left fingerprints on her soul. At the shop, everything felt louder, sharper, more grating than usual. The snip of scissors, the rustle of paper, the creak of the cooler door, they all seemed amplified, irritating. Her coworker, Denise, noticed her distracted mood. "You okay?" she asked, wrapping a ribbon around a vase of vibrant tulips. Olivia hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Just tired." "You look it," Denise said without cruelty, her gaze assessing. Long night? Olivia gave a small, distracted smile. You could say that. She didn't say more. How could she possibly explain it? How could she convey the feeling that her heart felt split down the middle? One half still spinning from the intimacy of Ethan's words, the other weighed down by the echo of her own doubts. That night, Ethan texted again. Can I see you tomorrow? She typed, erased, typed again. Finally, she settled on a simple yes. The next evening, he picked her up himself. This time, no sleek car service, no uniformed driver. Just Ethan, looking effortlessly handsome in dark jeans and a worn leather jacket, leaning casually against his silver Aston Martin parked in front of the shop. You look. He paused, grinning mischievously. Like trouble. She rolled her eyes, but a smile played on her lips. You're late. Fashionably, he said, opening the passenger door for her with a flourish. They drove out of the city, the music playing softly, the conversation lighter than usual. Ethan told her stories from his college days. How he once got locked in a wine cellar during a fundraiser and had to call his sister from a landline to be rescued. She laughed, grateful for the ease, grateful that he wasn't trying to impress her tonight, that he seemed content to simply be himself. They arrived at a small restaurant tucked between trees on a quiet hill. Candles flickered in every window, casting a warm, inviting glow, and a fireplace crackled merrily behind the bar, filling the air with the scent of burning wood. It was cozy, intimate, human. Olivia exhaled, relieved. But as the hostess greeted them, Olivia noticed the subtle pause, the almost imperceptible shift in demeanor when she said Ethan's name, the straightening of posture, the slight shift in tone, as if something clicked, and suddenly they weren't just a couple on a date. They were his guests, and that carried a weight of unspoken expectations. They were seated at a table by the fire, in a secluded corner of the dining room. The menu had no prices, an omission that spoke volumes. The wine list came in a leather-bound book, thicker than some novels. Olivia ran her fingers over the silverware, suddenly hyper-aware of how unfamiliar everything felt, how out of place she was. He noticed her unease. You okay? He asked gently, his brow furrowed with concern. She smiled, a little too quickly, a little too brightly. Of course. But the truth gnawed at her, a relentless undercurrent of anxiety. It wasn't just the restaurant. It was everything, the way the waiter deferred to Ethan, the glances from the other diners, the scent of cologne she couldn't name, the quiet pressure of trying to belong in a place that had its own unspoken rules, its own exclusive language. By the time dessert came, she was quiet, withdrawn, her thoughts a jumbled mess of doubts and insecurities. He leaned forward, his gaze searching. Talk to me. She looked down at her plate, avoiding his eyes. I don't want to ruin the night. You won't. She hesitated, gathering her courage. Then, I don't know how to fit into your world. He didn't speak right away, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Then you don't have to. That's easy for you to say, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. But you've never had to count how many meals are left in the fridge before payday, or fix your shoes with glue, or decide which bill can wait another week. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, a hint of pain flickering beneath the surface. Do you think I don't know struggle? I think you forgot it. The accusation landed heavier than she intended. She looked away, ashamed of her outburst. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice filled with remorse. That wasn't fair. No, he said quietly. It was honest. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She started, then stopped, unable to articulate the tangled mess of feelings churning inside her. I don't want to be someone you bring into your world like a novelty, a break from the noise. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his touch both comforting and grounding. You're not a break, Olivia, he said, his voice firm and unwavering. You're the only thing lately that's made sense. Her eyes welled up, the tears threatening to spill over. Then why do I feel so out of place? He gave a long exhale, the sound laced with weariness. Because my world is designed to keep people out. She looked at him, confused. And I've spent years letting it, he added, his voice lower now, filled with a hint of self-reproach. But I don't want to anymore. They sat in silence as the fire crackled beside them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing leaves against the window, a melancholic symphony of autumn. He continued, his voice even softer now, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. I know what this looks like. I know how ridiculous parts of my life are. But when I'm with you, I feel like I can breathe, like I can finally be myself. She bit her lip, trying to contain the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. Just don't run, he added, his gaze imploring. Even if it's scary, even if it's different, even if it feels like too much. I'm not running, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I'm just adjusting. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. I can work with that. When he walked her to her door later that night, he didn't try to kiss her. He just held her hands and looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke and mirrors. And for the first time, she believed him, almost. The invitation came in the form of a folded note, tucked inside a bouquet of wildflowers. A rustic collection of blooms that smelled of sunshine and earth. Let me show you where I go when the noise gets too loud. No date, no time, just that single, evocative sentence. Olivia held the paper between her fingers, her heart thudding with a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. Ethan hadn't called or texted since their dinner. Only this, but somehow it felt like more than a message. It felt like a key, a secret password to another part of his world. That Friday he arrived in person. He wore jeans, a worn flannel shirt, and boots that looked like they remembered mud. His clothes a far cry from the tailored suits she had seen him in before. His car this time wasn't sleek or silver. It was a navy SUV with scratches on the sides and pine needles still stuck to the tires. A vehicle that spoke of rough roads and hidden adventures. Ready? He asked, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. She stared at him, her mind racing. Where are we going? He smiled, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Away. They drove for hours, the city falling away behind them like a dream dissolving into the morning mist. Buildings turned to fields, fields to woods. The air changed, too, becoming cleaner, crisper, infused with the scent of pine and damp earth. Less exhaust, more earth. Olivia rolled down the window and let the wind tangle her hair, the cool breeze a welcome balm to her anxious thoughts. For the first time in days, she didn't feel watched. She didn't feel small. She didn't feel judged. She just existed, present in the moment, free from the weight of expectations. Ethan played music she didn't expect. Old acoustic tracks. Indie folk songs she'd forgotten she loved. Music that seemed to fit the landscape perfectly. They didn't talk much, but that was okay. The silence between them had grown comfortable, filled with a sense of shared understanding. A quiet connection that needed no words. Eventually, they turned onto a dirt road flanked by tall trees, the branches intertwining overhead to form a leafy canopy. A thick fog hung in the air, creating an ethereal, almost mystical atmosphere. At the end of the road stood a cabin, modest, weathered, and surrounded by nature so still it made Olivia hold her breath. "This is yours?" she asked, stepping out of the car, her voice hushed with awe. He nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "My grandfather built it. I keep it the way he left it." The lake shimmered behind the trees, catching the last rays of daylight. A small wooden dock reached into the water like an open hand, inviting her to step into the stillness. Birds chirped somewhere above, their melodies weaving through the silence. The only sound was nature itself, a symphony of rustling leaves and gentle breezes. Olivia wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't realized she was craving. "It's beautiful." Ethan grabbed their bags and gestured towards the porch, his expression relaxed and unguarded. No service, by the way. No internet, no signal, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. She raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "You sure you'll survive?" He grinned, his eyes sparkling with genuine joy. "Already feel better." Inside, the cabin was warm in the way. Old places held a certain charm, imbued with the scent of pine, lingering smoke, and echoes of memories. The living room was cozy, dominated by a stone fireplace and two well-worn armchairs that had witnessed countless stories. A faded quilt, its colors softened by time, was draped casually over the couch, offering an invitation to snuggle. Framed black and white photographs adorned the walls, capturing moments of men in fishing hats, their faces weathered by sun and wind, and women laughing beside the comforting warmth of wood stoves. Ethan set down the bags with a soft thud and turned to Olivia, a playful glint in his eyes. Hungry? I could devour a whole bear. He was no culinary genius, his cooking skills bordering on disastrous, but he insisted on the ritual of making grilled cheese over the crackling fire. Olivia couldn't suppress her laughter as she watched his frustrated grimace, the bread charring ever so slightly under his watch. "Don't you dare say a word," he warned, his tone mock-threatening. "Wouldn't dream of it," she replied, still chuckling. Finally, they settled down, legs folded comfortably on the floor, balancing plates precariously on their laps. Ethan presented her with a sandwich, his grin radiating pride. "Burnt to perfection," he declared with mock solemnity. She took a bite, her eyes widening. "Crunchy, bold," she pronounced, savoring the unexpected texture. He nodded gravely. "Exactly my intention." Later, they curled up near the fireplace, the dancing flames casting long, flickering shadows on the rustic log walls. Olivia rested her head against the worn arm of the couch, her feet tucked beneath her for warmth. Ethan sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees, gazing into the heart of the fire as if it held the secrets of the universe. "You really come here alone?" she asked, her voice soft, breaking the comfortable silence. He nodded. "Every time things get too loud." "What gets loud?" "Expectations, people. The relentless voice in my head that keeps a scorecard of my every move." She tilted her head, intrigued. "Scorecard?" He looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "Success comes with a set of rules. Keep growing. Keep proving your worth. Never show weakness. Never slow down, not even for a moment. But here, no one knows my name, and that's the beauty of it." She let his words settle in, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I can see why you love it here," she said. "It feels honest, stripped bare of pretense." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression. "That's the whole point." Olivia stared into the mesmerizing dance of the flames. The crackling soot and the pungent smell of burning would evoke childhood memories of long, snowy winters, of sitting beside her dad on cold nights, mismatched socks warming by the fire, listening to his fantastical stories about the constellations. It had been a long time since she'd felt something so raw, so unpolished, so utterly real. They didn't speak for a while, content to breathe in the comforting silence of the cabin. It was Ethan who finally broke the spell. "You want to know the truth?" She looked at him, curiosity piqued. "I used to come here to escape, to be alone with my thoughts. Now, I think I come here to remember who I was before everything got so complicated." She nodded slowly, understanding his sentiment. "And who was that?" He chuckled softly, a hint of self-deprecation in his voice. "A boy with scraped knees and unwavering optimism who thought money could fix everything." "Can it?" she asked gently. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a profound honesty. "No." The sincerity in his voice cracked something open inside her, a long-dormant vulnerability. She looked down, her fingers nervously picking at the edge of the faded quilt. "I used to believe that love came with conditions," she confessed quietly. "What kind of conditions?" "Be good. Be small. Don't ask for too much. Don't ever break. Be easy to love." Ethan moved closer, kneeling in front of her, his presence radiating warmth and reassurance. "That's not love, Olivia. That's a transaction. It's what I learned too. Well, unlearn it." Her eyes welled up with unshed tears. He reached for her hand, holding it with a gentle reverence, as if it were something fragile and incredibly rare. "You don't have to perform here, Olivia," he said, his voice laced with tenderness. You can just be. Her lip trembled, the weight of years of suppressed emotions pressing down on her. I don't know how, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He squeezed her fingers gently, offering silent support. Then let this be your practice ground. They stayed like that for a long time, hands clasped together, the dancing fire reflecting in their eyes. She had no words, only the profound sensation of being safe, truly safe, for the first time in her life. Later, when the fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, they stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars were impossibly bright, a breathtaking tapestry of light against the inky sky. No city lights to diminish their brilliance, just the vast expanse of sky and water and two people cautiously, tentatively learning how to see each other without the filters of expectation and distraction. Olivia leaned against the weathered wooden railing of the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the slight chill. Ethan stood beside her, his presence a comforting warmth. You cold? He asked, his voice filled with concern. A little. He draped the quilt over her shoulders, its familiar scent enveloping her in a sense of peace. She looked up at him, searching his face for some sign that this wasn't all too good to be true, a fleeting dream that would soon shatter. But he was looking at her with such unwavering honesty, like he had nothing left to hide, no carefully constructed facade to maintain. And for once, she allowed herself to believe it. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but something deeper, more profound, passed between them, quieter than desire, louder than any words could express. Trust. The city felt jarringly loud after the profound silence of the lake. The incessant honking of horns, the sharp angles of glass buildings that scraped the sky, the blur of faces rushing past, each lost in their own world. It all hit Olivia differently now, as if the quietude of the cabin still clung to her skin, making the city feel foreign, noisy, artificial. Ethan parked his car outside her building and walked her to the door, holding her hand with a familiarity and tenderness that belied the fact that they had just spent the last 2 days wrapped in the peace of pine trees and comfortable silence. She turned to him, her heart still lingering in the woods, beside the tranquil lake. Thank you, she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. For what? He asked, his brow furrowing slightly. For not rushing anything, she explained. For letting me breathe, for giving me space to simply be. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I like your pace. She leaned in, drawn to him like a moth to a flame, and for the first time, kissed him. It was slow and steady, like the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, like the quiet truth that had been slowly unfolding between them. Days passed, and things moved with a gentle, unhurried rhythm. They texted each other snippets of their days, shared late-night phone calls filled with laughter and whispered confessions, met for quick coffee dates when their demanding schedules allowed. Ethan visited her flower shop more often than was strictly necessary, often under the flimsy excuse of needing inspiration for some grand design, though he invariably left with a single stem of a vibrant bloom and a new reason to smile. It was Olivia who tentatively suggested that he join her at the upcoming charity gala, a prestigious event held to benefit the Botanical Gardens. It's at the Botanical Gardens, she said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. I do their centerpieces every spring. It's kind of a big deal. Ethan hesitated, a shadow passing over his face. You sure? Why wouldn't I be? She asked, her brow furrowing in concern. He smiled faintly, a hint of self-deprecation in his voice. Because my presence tends to change the temperature of a room. People have expectations. I don't mind a little heat, she replied playfully, dismissing his concerns with a wave of her hand. That night, she wore a midnight blue dress borrowed from her boss's niece, a sophisticated garment that hugged her waist and flowed like liquid moonlight when she moved. She tied her hair up in a loose, elegant bun, allowing a few strands to fall artfully, softening the sharp angles of her face. Ethan met her outside the grand event hall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, worn with a casual elegance that eschewed the need for a tie. He looked undeniably expensive, but in a way that felt effortless, understated. "You look," he began, his voice catching in his throat. "Don't say nice," she teased, her eyes dancing with amusement. "I was going to say breathtaking," he corrected, his gaze fixed on her. Her cheeks flushed with a delicate blush. "That's acceptable," she conceded with a playful smile. He offered her his arm, a gesture both courtly and sincere. "Shall we?" The gala was held under a breathtaking canopy of twinkling lights, nestled amongst meticulously arranged rose beds and manicured paths that snaked through the sprawling gardens. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays laden with champagne flutes and smoked salmon canapes. The air was filled with the soft strains of classical music, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. At first, everything felt magical, like stepping into a dream. But then, imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to shift, and Olivia noticed it in subtle waves. A momentary pause in a conversation as she approached a group of elegantly dressed guests. The fleeting glance a woman gave her shoes before offering a smile that felt a little too sweet, a little too practiced. The way Ethan's name was whispered between guests, spoken with a reverence that felt more like currency than admiration. Montgomery, power, money. Some nodded politely when she was introduced, offering perfunctory greetings. Others asked with a carefully veiled curiosity where she was from, their tone implying the unspoken questions. "What do you do? Who do you belong to? What gives you the right to be here?" She answered with grace and poise, but the questions lingered, an invisible weight settling on her shoulders, like a perfume that didn't quite suit her skin. When Ethan stepped away to take an urgent phone call, a man in a tailored navy suit, his face etched with the confidence of wealth and power, approached her with a practiced smile. "You must be the florist," he said, his tone carrying a hint of condescension. Olivia blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I am," she replied, maintaining her composure. "I've seen your work," he continued, his smile unwavering. "Lovely arrangements." "Thank you. Not the usual company Ethan keeps," the man added, taking a sip of his champagne. His eyes narrowed slightly as he observed her reaction. She tried to smile, refusing to let his words penetrate her carefully constructed facade. "He surprises people," she said evenly. "That he does," the man said, nodding slowly, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. And then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the swirling crowd. The whole exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but it stuck with her, a tiny barb lodging itself beneath her skin. Later, back at her side, Ethan noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, the faint tightening around her eyes. "You okay?" he asked, brushing his hand lightly along her arm, his touch a comforting reassurance. She nodded, offering a smile that felt a little too forced. "Fine." They danced, Ethan holding her close as if no one else in the room mattered. But she felt them all watching, their eyes scrutinizing her every move. And when the night finally ended and he dropped her off at her apartment, she didn't kiss him, just squeezed his hand tightly and said, "Thank you for tonight." The next morning, Ethan stormed into his office, his jaw tight with barely suppressed anger. "You spoke to her?" he demanded, slamming the door behind him with a force that made the windows rattle. His business partner, Charles Whitmore, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with a look of cool detachment, looked up from his laptop, his expression unperturbed. "Good morning to you too, Ethan. Such a charming start to the day." "Don't deflect, Charles. You approached Olivia at the gala." Whitmore raised a brow, his gaze unwavering. "I merely introduced myself. I believe it's called common courtesy. You made her uncomfortable." "I made an observation, Ethan," Whitmore replied, leaning back in his chair, his voice laced with a hint of condescension. "She's sweet, undeniably, but incredibly out of her depth in that world." Ethan's eyes darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "That's not your judgment to make, Charles." Charles leaned back further, his eyes shrewd. "You've worked tirelessly to build this brand, Ethan. to cultivate your reputation. One public misstep, one wrong impression, and we're fielding uncomfortable questions from our investors. You know how this world works. Ethan's hands curled even tighter, his knuckles white. You think she's a liability? I think she's a reality check, Ethan, Charles said, his voice softening slightly. A reminder that there's a world outside our gilded cage. Ethan stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then maybe reality needs adjusting, he said, his voice dangerously low, and he turned and left the office without another word. Olivia didn't hear from Ethan that night, nor the next. She didn't panic, not immediately, but the silence echoed in her apartment, amplifying her anxieties. At the flower shop, she found herself checking her phone far too often, her eyes scanning the screen for his name. At home, she replayed every moment from the gala in her mind, wondering if she had missed something, said something wrong, worn the wrong thing, smiled too much, smiled too little. Had she broken some invisible rule of their world? A world she didn't understand and didn't know how to navigate? When Ethan finally called, his voice sounded heavy, burdened by an unspoken weight. "Can I see you?" he asked, his tone subdued. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. They met in a quiet cafe, tucked away on a quiet street, a place where the clatter of coffee cups and the murmur of conversations created a comforting anonymity. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced than she remembered. She did too. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They talked to me," he said, his voice flat. "Who?" she asked, her stomach clenching with apprehension. "My partners, my board," he explained. "They think I'm distracted." She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "Because of me?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. "I'm not embarrassed by you, Olivia," he said finally, his voice filled with sincerity. "But they think you don't fit the image." She blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. "And do you think that?" He shook his head, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that pierced through her fear. "I think they're wrong. But they have power, Olivia. A lot of it." "Yes," she acknowledged, her voice barely audible. "So what does that mean for us?" He looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes searching hers for some sign of understanding, of hope. "It means we're going to have to choose what matters more, them or this." A beat of silence passed between them, heavy with unspoken questions and anxieties. "I can handle whispers," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I can handle glances, but I won't be made to feel like I'm your mistake, Ethan. You're not." "Then fight for me," she said, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "I already am," he replied, reaching for her hand across the table. She gripped it tightly, her fingers interlacing with his. The world wasn't going to make it easy. She knew that. But neither of them was ready to let go, not yet. The bell above the door chimed softly as Ethan stepped into the flower shop. It wasn't grand. No opulent displays or carefully curated vignettes. It wasn't even particularly neat. Buckets of fresh blooms lined the floor, their vibrant colors clashing in a joyful chaos. Ribbons of every imaginable hue trailed from open drawers, a vibrant tapestry of texture and light. A small, slightly out-of-tune radio played an old love song in the background, its melody both comforting and slightly melancholic. The air was thick with the intoxicating scent of lavender, eucalyptus, and sun-warmed petals. And Ethan Montgomery, millionaire investor, son of glass towers and sterile boardroom ceilings, paused just inside the door, his senses overwhelmed by the unexpected beauty of the space. He wasn't used to this kind of beauty, this raw, unpolished, deeply personal expression of creativity and passion. Behind the counter, Olivia looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of anticipation and cautious hope. She didn't smile right away, just held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You showed up," she said, her voice soft, almost a question. "You asked me to fight," he replied, his tone firm, resolute. "This is where it starts." A slow smile spread across her face, her eyes lighting up with a genuine joy. "Then grab an apron," she said, gesturing towards a rack of worn canvas aprons hanging near the back. Denise, Olivia's coworker, a vibrant woman with a penchant for bright lipstick and even brighter opinions, nearly dropped a vase when Ethan was introduced. "You're that Ethan Montgomery?" she asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. He gave a modest nod, already half covered in green smudges from wrestling with a particularly thorny rose bush. "Apparently. Do you own suits made of money or something?" Denise asked, her voice filled with awe. He laughed, the sound echoing through the small shop. "Just overpriced jackets. Want one? I want your tax bracket," Denise retorted, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Olivia groaned, rolling her eyes playfully. "Denise, be nice. I'm being welcoming," Denise protested, throwing her hands up in mock defense. They spent the morning assembling bouquets, a chaotic symphony of color and fragrance. Ethan, surprisingly, followed instructions well, once he stopped trying to color coordinate the arrangements based on stock prices. Olivia watched him carefully, studying his movements, trying to gauge his sincerity. He wasn't just pretending to participate, going through the motions for her benefit. He asked questions, genuine questions about the different types of flowers, their origins, their symbolism. He got dirt under his fingernails, a testament to his willingness to fully immerse himself in her world. He tied ribbons that were lopsided and uneven, but sincere, each knot a tangible expression of his effort. At one point, he held up a small arrangement of tulips and daisies, his brow furrowed in concern. "This is crooked," he said, pointing to a stem that stubbornly refused to stand upright. "It's charming," Olivia corrected, her voice laced with affection. "You mean terrible," he countered, his lips twitching with amusement. "I mean, it looks like something made by someone who cares," she explained, her eyes meeting his. He looked at her, his expression softening. "Then I'll take it," he said, his voice filled with tenderness. She laughed, the sound light and carefree, and just like that, the heaviness from the gala began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of lightness and connection. That afternoon, Ethan stayed for lunch. Not a meticulously planned reservation at a Michelin-starred restaurant, not rooftop sushi with panoramic city views. Instead, they walked a few blocks to a small neighborhood pizza place, a local institution where the owner knew Olivia by name and brought out complimentary garlic knots on the house. A gesture of warmth and familiarity. They sat in a booth with chipped red leather seats, paper napkins, and soda in tall plastic cups, the epitome of unpretentious comfort. Olivia folded her slice of pizza in half, New York style, like she always did. Ethan attempted the same maneuver, but ended up with a smear of cheese and tomato sauce on his expensive shirt cuff. "You're very brave," she teased, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "I like to live dangerously," he replied with a grin, licking sauce from his thumb, unconcerned about the stain. Their laughter blended into the clatter of dishes and the background chatter of the restaurant, a cacophony of everyday sounds that suddenly felt comforting and familiar. For the first time in weeks, neither of them felt like they had to explain who they were, to justify their choices, to pretend to be someone they weren't. They just were comfortable and content in each other's company. Ethan leaned back against the worn booth, his eyes softening as he watched Olivia. "I can see why you like it here," he said, his voice quiet. She tilted her head, a question in her eyes. "Because of the pizza?" he joked, his lips twitching with a smile. "Because of how people look at you," she corrected, her voice filled with sincerity. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He continued her thought. "Not because they want something from you. Not because they expect you to be anything other than exactly who you are." Her breath caught in her throat, his words resonating with her on a profound level. "It's humbling," he added, his gaze meeting hers, "and grounding, and honestly kind of addictive." She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression, and he reached for her hand across the table, his fingers interlacing with hers. No flash photography, no audience to impress, just real, unadulterated connection. Later, back at the shop, Olivia showed him the storage room, a space that revealed the less glamorous side of her profession. It wasn't pretty, just shelves piled high with vases of all shapes and sizes, bundles of dried flowers hanging from the ceiling, and an old refrigerator humming loudly in the corner, filled with perishable blooms. But there, away from the hustle and bustle of the customers, she opened up to him in ways she hadn't before, revealing her vulnerabilities, her insecurities, her hopes and dreams. "This is where I come when I need to think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I need to remind myself that even the messiest, most chaotic things can still be beautiful." He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her with a gentle understanding. "Is that what you think we are? A mess?" "Yeah," she nodded, her eyes meeting his. "But in a good way." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You know, I've spent years making everything look effortless," he confessed, his voice laced with a hint of weariness. "The suits, the speeches, the numbers, it's all work, calculated and exhausting." She looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion. "And here?" she asked softly. "Here," he said, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "I don't want to be perfect. I just want to be enough." She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. "You already are," she said, her voice filled with conviction. He exhaled slowly, and she could see the tension leaving his shoulders, the weight of years of expectations finally lifting. That evening, they walked through Olivia's neighborhood, a vibrant tapestry of urban life. It was loud, but in a different way than the city center, a cacophony of sounds that spoke of community and connection. Kids on scooters laughing as they raced down the sidewalk, music spilling from open windows, neighbors waving from balconies, their voices carrying on the warm evening air. They stopped at a park bench under a sprawling tree, its branches adorned with twinkling string lights, creating a magical, intimate space amidst the urban landscape. "This is where I grew up," Olivia said, pointing to a faded brick building across the street, its facade worn with age. "Third floor, 1 bathroom, 100 stories. Your parents are gone now?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with a gentle sympathy. "Yeah," she replied, her gaze fixed on the building, lost in memories. "But they made every square foot feel like home." Ethan was quiet, sensing the depth of emotion behind her words. "I used to be ashamed of this," she added, her voice barely audible. "Of where I came from, of what I didn't have." He turned to her, his eyes filled with an unwavering sincerity. "You shouldn't be," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not anymore," she replied, her smile tinged with a hint of sadness. "Because now I know what having really means." "And what's that?" he asked, his voice soft, encouraging. She looked at him, her eyes shining with a profound understanding. "Love, safety, people who see you for who you really are, not for what they want you to be." He didn't respond, his emotions evident in his eyes. He just pulled her into a long, quiet embrace beneath the soft glow of the string lights. Back in her apartment, they sat cross-legged on the floor, sharing store-bought cookies and cheap red wine from mismatched mugs, their conversation flowing easily between laughter and shared silences. Ethan glanced around the small space, taking in the details that spoke volumes about her life. The haphazard stacks of books piled sideways on the shelves, the old, slightly saggy couch with one leg shorter than the others, the collection of Polaroids pinned to the wall, capturing fleeting moments of joy and friendship. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't symmetrical, but it was hers, and it was filled with a warmth and personality that he found utterly captivating. And he found himself falling in love with every corner, every imperfection, every tangible expression of her unique spirit. "You know," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been in hundreds of homes more expensive than this, filled with priceless art and designer furniture." She raised a brow, her lips twitching with amusement. "Of course you have. But this one feels warmer," he continued, his voice filled with sincerity. "Probably the radiator stuck on high," she joked, deflecting his compliment with a playful self-deprecation. He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, it's you, Olivia. It's your spirit, your presence. that fills this place with warmth and light. She looked down, suddenly shy, her cheeks flushed with a delicate blush. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb caressing her soft skin. You don't need chandeliers or a live-in staff or expensive statements, Olivia, he said, his voice filled with tenderness. You light up a room with your presence alone. And I didn't realize how dark mine had been until you walked in. Her throat tightened, choked with emotion. You mean that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I mean every word, he replied, his gaze unwavering. They sat in the comfortable silence that followed, full, safe, whole, and for once, neither of them felt like they had anything to prove, anything to hide. The invitation came again, but this time it wasn't delivered on delicate stationery, adorned with flowers, or in the form of hastily scribbled notes. This time, it was Ethan himself, showing up at Olivia's shop on one ordinary Thursday afternoon, holding a wicker picnic basket and wearing a crooked, slightly nervous smile. Come with me? He asked, his voice filled with a hopeful anticipation. She blinked, momentarily stunned by the suddenness of his invitation. Where? To the lake, he replied, his smile widening. Just for the day. No phones, no expectations, just you and me, surrounded by nature and silence. She looked at Denise, her eyes searching for guidance. Denise mouthed the word go with an enthusiastic urgency. So she went, leaving the shop in Denise's capable hands, trusting that everything would be all right. The drive to the lake felt different this time. There was no nervous anticipation, no anxious guessing, no underlying current of uncertainty, just a peaceful anticipation, a quiet sense of excitement. They didn't talk much, content to simply be in each other's presence, enjoying the familiar scenery as they drove towards their sanctuary. The trees leaned in over the winding road in the same way they always did, their branches forming a verdant canopy overhead. The dirt road curved and twisted exactly as before, leading them deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods. And when they finally arrived at the cabin, Olivia stepped out of the car like she was coming home, her feet treading familiar ground. The porch creaked reassuringly under her weight, the sound a welcome greeting. The door opened with that same familiar sound, a slightly rusty hinge protesting after a long period of disuse. But something was different, subtle changes that hinted at a deliberate effort, a thoughtful preparation. The cabin had been gently transformed, imbued with a romantic charm that spoke of care and intention. Candles flickered warmly from inside glass jars placed along the windowsills, their soft light illuminating the interior with a gentle glow. Twinkle lights were strung across the porch beams, casting a soft, golden light that danced on the weathered wood. A delicate line of white wildflowers, freshly picked from the surrounding woods, lined the pathway to the dock, their delicate blooms adding a touch of ethereal beauty to the rustic landscape. And music, just a whisper of violin music, drifted through the open window, subtle and slow, creating an atmosphere of intimate romance. Olivia turned to him, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide with wonder. Ethan, she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. He held her hand, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that spoke volumes. I needed to bring you back here, he said, his voice filled with sincerity, because this is where everything changed for me. She squeezed his fingers, her heart overflowing with love. You're not going to make me dance again, are you? She asked, teasing him gently. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Not unless you want to. They walked hand in hand toward the dock, their footsteps echoing softly on the wooden planks. It was dusk now, the sky painted with vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple. The lake reflected the fading sun like liquid fire, its surface shimmering with an ethereal glow. The trees stood tall and still, silhouetted against the colorful sky, their branches reaching towards the heavens like silent guardians. Everything felt suspended in time, as if the universe had conspired to create this perfect moment just for them. At the end of the dock, a small table was set with 2 chairs and soft linens, the scene illuminated by the gentle glow of candlelight. Nothing extravagant, nothing ostentatious, just enough to create an atmosphere of intimate elegance. They sat down, their shoulders brushing against each other, their bodies radiating a comforting warmth. He poured her a glass of chilled white wine, the liquid sparkling in the candlelight. She let her shoes fall off her feet and dipped her toes into the cool water below, feeling the gentle lapping of the waves against her skin. For a long moment, they said nothing, content to simply be in each other's presence, absorbing the beauty of the natural world around them. And then, Ethan spoke, breaking the comfortable silence with a quiet sincerity. "You changed me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a profound emotion. Olivia looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I didn't even know I was asleep until I met you," he continued, his gaze fixed on hers, his eyes shining with a heartfelt honesty. "You reminded me how it feels to feel, not to manage, not to perform, but to truly feel, to connect with the world on a deeper level." She blinked, trying to hold back the tears that were welling up in her throat, threatening to spill over. "You let me be imperfect, flawed, vulnerable," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "and still worthy of your love." She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "You are," she said, her voice filled with conviction. He smiled, but it wavered slightly, revealing the depth of his vulnerability. "I've had everything I ever thought I wanted, Olivia," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And none of it meant anything until you." He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. Her heart skipped a beat, her senses heightened, her mind racing with anticipation. "I want the world to see what I see in you," he said, his voice resonating with a passionate intensity. He walked around the table slowly, his gaze fixed on hers, his every step deliberate and meaningful. Then, on the edge of that weathered dock, surrounded by the soft glow of lights and the tranquil stillness of the water, he dropped to one knee, his posture radiating both humility and unwavering devotion. Olivia covered her mouth with both hands, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes overflowing with tears. Ethan reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling slightly, and pulled out a small velvet box, its darkness contrasting sharply with the soft glow of the candlelight. But he didn't open it, not yet. "I could give you diamonds," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I will, if that's what you want. I could give you a house, a name, a life that most people can only imagine, and I will without hesitation. But that's not the point." She nodded, her tears. For the first time in her life, she witnessed a woman unbound by expectations, a woman whose worth wasn't measured by ambition or pretense. This woman was loved simply for being herself, a revelation born from finally allowing her true self to be seen, flaws and all, and reciprocating love without reservation or self-diminishment. Perhaps it resembled a fairy tale, but not the kind spun from gilded threads and towering castles. This was a tale rooted in the simple truths of human connection, where the magic resided not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, unwavering miracle of choosing each other, day after day. She didn't triumph by conforming to an ideal, nor by eclipsing others with manufactured brilliance. Her victory lay in the subtle language of everyday affection, in a love that whispered rather than shouted, a love that endured the trials of time. She won when she danced with him barefoot on the grass, her dress rumpled and carefree, surrendering to the joy of the moment. Because, ultimately, genuine fairy tales aren't adorned with crowns and thrones. They're built on the foundation of shared hands and deliberate choices made in the ordinariness of life. They're about the everyday heroism of choosing love, forgiveness, and understanding. And perhaps, deep within our hearts, this narrative resonates with us all. Maybe it speaks to the longing we all harbor for authentic connection, for the freedom to be loved not for who we pretend to be, but for who we truly are. If this story has touched your soul, if it has sparked a flicker of recognition within you, we invite you to leave a like, to subscribe to our channel, and to share with us the place from which you're listening. Your support is the lifeblood of this channel, the very inspiration that fuels our commitment to bringing you stories that stir the heart and nourish the spirit. Music,